when you're teaching as well, or you have knitting groups and stuff, I think the meditative nature of it just makes people open up. You feel like, you're part teacher, part counsellor, part barmaid or something like that. And, the best teachers or photographers or composers, artists understand a lot about people. They have that empathy. And it shows through in their work. The storytelling is always there, I think.
Hello and welcome to a special episode of the Crimson Stitchery on the road. Today I'm in the beautiful garden of the wonderful Natalie Warner. How are you, Natalie?
I'm all right. How are you? Thanks for coming.
Thanks for having me. Natalie is a very experienced and talented knitwear designer as well as teacher. And today we're going to be having a conversation about Natalie's career, how you got into it and your inspiration and your process. So when I first met you, I was really struck that you introduced yourself as a teacher of sewing and knitting as well as a designer, and that seemed very firm. What came first for you?
Sewing, actually. Sewing. I learnt to sew first before I did anything else, really. Knitting knitting and crochet were last, to be honest, because I think with my family, I think my great-gran was a machinist for Marks and Spencer's, and I think various other generations all sort of sewed. I think my maternal grandmother was the only one who didn't. This is all on the maternal line. And so the sewing machine was the first machine associated with clothes making, any kind of creativity that I ever saw. And so that was the first one that I wanted to get involved with. So, the sewing came first, and then actually machine knitting, because a childminder I had at the time had a machine, and she used to just make herself cardigans when we're all fed and settled, and I just used to watch her just go shoo, 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 all with the carriage, and this cardigan would just appear out of nowhere. And then it wasn't until late teens, really, that I went back into knitting again, because I just found myself with a lot of time on my hands. I thought, I'll just learn. And it's just sort of faded into life, really. It was just something occasional, and it became something like a hobby / occupational therapy when you have a 9 to 5. And then I really got stuck into it after that.
So did you learn to knit on the machine first?
Well, yeah, I did actually. I got, based on my childminder's influence, my grandparents bought me my first knitting machine, which was this pink plastic thing made by Tomy. And I think I was about 7 when I got that. And it came with a couple of spools and transfer tools and things like that, and a nice little handbook so that you could learn how to just do samples, tucking, all that kind of thing. And I thought it was great. I thought this is much quicker than needles, because by that point I'd tried knitting on metal needles, little kiddie things, and hated it because it went so slowly, and I just was I was knitting very tightly, and I was fed up, and so I enjoyed that a lot. But obviously machines are a fixed size. They have a certain amount of needles in the bed, and it got to a point where I couldn't really make anything that was much wider than a scarf, or either that or I'd grown too much. So back I went to the sewing machine. And that was...
So it was quite kind of centred, it sounds like, around the experience of using the tools and the equipment that you had.
Definitely. I mean, I'm very kinesthetic. I definitely have to be a doer, and sometimes when I'm learning repetitive things like knitting or dancing or instruments and stuff, I'm very, I think I used to frustrate teachers because I learned messily, or I think they would see that I could do something really well once I got it, but it was the getting, really, because sometimes I would just get things wrong randomly. Or I would just blank out a little bit. But once it got stuck in, I never got it wrong again. And I don't know, there's that thing about 10,000 repetitions or something. That was
10,000 hours.
Yeah, that's it. So I don't know if I actually clocked up that, but it just gets to a point where when I'm learning things like that, subconsciously I will do it right, and I have no idea where it came from. It will just fade in, and then eventually my conscious and subconscious mind will marry up, and I won't have to think about what I'm doing again. It's just that sort of, toing and froing a little bit as I'm getting to grips with what I'm learning.
I'm really captivated by this idea of the fact that you had these knitting machines as well as the sewing machines just around you in daily life, because people don't really have or use domestic flatbed knitting machines in the same way anymore, do they? Or?
Well, I think it's due a renaissance personally, because, you know, I was just last weekend, I was teaching somebody at Vogue, and, you know, my eyes just sort of lit up. I just went to her straight away because she had about 3 or 4 knitting machines in her workroom, and I was just like, oh gosh, well, we must ask her about those later. And I was really interested. And what she was doing was she was taking my class, which was on hand knitting. It was pattern drafting for a raglands, and she was trying to marry up the principles that I was sharing in that class to what she already knew about machine knitting, and then trying to find her own way with the two of them due to the lack of availability of material specifically for machine knitting, because it's fine up until, say, about the 1990s-ish. Yeah. And then after that, it's just, you know, what people might know in their learn from their studios, their work experience, career, that kind of thing. The quality of the information that people get is very bitty. There's no one central book that you can go to, or selection of books that you can use, as you could say, for pattern cutting, hand knitting, where you can just confer with a few authoritative or experienced voices on the subject. It's very much people still muddling through at the moment. So
was it like that when you were growing up and observing people using knitting machines?
It wasn't that bad, I don't think, because at that point you could still get relatively new knitting machines. You could still get new Brother machines at that point. I don't think Brothers stopped manufacturing until mid-90s-ish, I think, or even earlier possibly. So the knowledge was still pretty fresh. Now, obviously, that's really different. Not very many people know about, you know, new knitting machine manufacturers. A lot of stuff is bought second-hand, and it's really just knowledge that people have amassed over time. So I think there is a lot of work to do, but I think once it gets there, kind of like how crochet is now with the More It magazine and what Alison's doing with that, then I think it will be really amazing. But it's a separate craft in its own right, and I hope that it will be recognised as such over time, I think.
What did you used to make on your little machine?
Not a lot is the short answer. I just liked doing the samples. I just really liked engaging with the tools. What could it do? Just working out patterns, basically, because I love pattern generally. I just wanted to see, OK, what if I did this? What if I did that? You know, the experimentation was what I really like. And I'm still like that now when I design. There's 2 ways that I approach it. Sometimes I will have a picture in my head, and it's a question of, you know, just having a quick sketch or record of it and then bringing it to life. But the nicest things, I think, or the ones that I have most fun doing, when I just get a yarn that I really like working with, I think, oh, this is lovely to knit with, I wonder if I do that. And then I just produce loads and loads of swatches, just tinkering around with pattern, changing scale and, you know, size of the repeats, that kind of thing.
So is that your kind of favourite starting point, to really start with the fabric and exploring?
Yeah, absolutely, because that is what dictates, really, isn't it? I think sometimes with hand knit, fabrication isn't talked about enough. I mean, I think people understand fibres and spinning stuff really well. I'm really bad at spinning. I know there's different ways you can spin and ply yarn, but don't ask me about anything, what they're called. I mean, I get chain net and plies, but don't ask me about anything else, please. It will be embarrassing.
The S and the Z.
Yeah, that's related to thread as well, so that bit's okay. But it's very weak. I have definite black spots, but but really, I think with fabric, it's a big deal because you've got the fibre type with yarn, and that obviously affects what it's like when it's still a bit of string wound up into a skein or ball. But once you start knitting with it and you bring things like tension into it, you've got so much you can do, because you've got your baseline stocking stitch tension, which is, you know, what a lot of people use in patterns, and then depending on, you know, changing the needle size, the kind of techniques you use with the stitches, whether you've got eyelets for lace because that will make it spread laterally, whether you've got garter stitch because that will make the row tension contract, all sorts of variables that can really come into it when you start designing with fabric. That's partly why pattern is such a big deal for me. You know, you're also creating pictures in the yarn when you have cables, twists, lace, colours, but you're also changing the character of the fabric simultaneously. And I love that. I really love that. This one bit of string or two bits can turn into anything and be anything as long as you have control and understanding of how they all work together. I love it.
It's very transformative.
Yeah, definitely.
Especially under your hands.
Oh, thank you. I mean, it's just a lot of it is playtime, I think, and I think sometimes, you know, when you do these kinds of things professionally, you forget that you have to have playtime.
Yeah.
That's where all the good ideas come. You just have to give yourself a break and think, oh gosh, I need to publish this. It's been a while. I've been quiet, and you know. I think that's one of the things that leads to burnout for some people. If you're continually under pressure to pump out ideas, you lose the joy that comes with play. And yeah, I don't want to lose it.
Yeah, I can relate as well.
Yeah.
So for you personally, how did you go from, you know, playing around with all of your different samples that you were making on your machine and transitioning into actually designing with these fabrics that you're creating as your profession?
Well, I hate to say it, but the machine was abandoned a bit once I realised that I couldn't do as much with it as I wanted to, because my childminder, I mean, she moved and I ended up going to secondary school, so I didn't really have touch with her anymore, and nobody in the family knitted on the machine. So it went back to hand knit, and it got to the point where I was old enough so that my mother said, I'm not making you any clothes anymore. If you want something, you make it yourself. And so obviously that put me on the spot.
So was your mum making all of your clothes before?
A lot of them, yeah, definitely.
Wow.
I think my favourite clothes of the child are the ones that she made. She made, oh gosh, between her and my grandmother, they made loads of things. There's so many pictures of me and stuff that she made. Obviously dresses, because dresses were my favourite thing and still are. I mean, she made me pinafores, cardigans, jumpers, all that kind of thing. And obviously as you get older and, you know, I was in school uniform, the pressure to make clothes went a little bit. And that was in contrast to my primary school, because we didn't have uniform back then for my school. I think some primary schools did, but mine didn't. So you were in your own clothes all the time. And so everyone looked different anyway. But I just really liked the idea of, you know, someone has... my mum's made this for me. It was an expression of their love and care for me in that sense. And so when I asked her to make things, it wasn't necessarily being demanding or spoiled, like, no, I saw this in a picture, I want you to make it for me. It was that sort of love that I was looking for again. But
I can relate to that as well, because sometimes I do have family members and friends like actually beg me to make things for them. And sometimes I'm like, oh, no, I'm too busy, I can't do that. But actually, it's quite nice to be asked and to feel like what you've created is so valued and cherished.
Yeah, oh, definitely. I mean, I've kept everything, basically. I mean, even to I think a blanket that I went home from the hospitalings. My grandmother, she used to be a nurse. She was a Windrush generation person. Both sides of my family are of that age group. And she used to work in St Thomas's Hospital where I was born. And one of her colleagues crocheted me a blanket, and I never got to find out who it was. And it's too late. It's too late to ask now, but we still have the blanket. And so it's that community feeling, you know, just women as caregivers and, you know, using your skills to provide for your family. And that's informed the way that I design now, really. I mean, you could do a lot of things with knitting, I think. When they tell you about careers and things, you can go into swatch development, you can do, I don't know, you can be a garment technologist, you can do all sorts of things, but I never lost the functionality of it, because whilst it's a really deeply creative skill set, it's also a very purposeful one. And I think that's probably why I like garments most, not just because they were made for me, but, you know, you want to keep warm and you also want to wear something beautiful. It's that sort of cultural heritage that comes into it as well.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And you did also tell me that you had a bit of a diversion at a certain point, and you...
Which one?
into medieval studies at one point.
Yeah, I did. The diversion was called a master's degree. But no, it was interesting at the time.
Yeah.
But I think I don't regret it. But I think my life experience is kind of testament to the fact that sometimes you need a bit more maturity to decide, or time to decide what you actually want to do. It's the difference between an interest and what's actually going to serve you on a long-term basis, I think. And I think the medieval studies was definitely something I was interested in, but not necessarily in a scholarly way. What I really enjoyed on it, I really enjoyed reading Chaucer, and I really enjoyed the cultural side of things, the societies that inspired the literature, and just looking at the humanity of it really, and how in some ways the things that we take away from history are that, you know, humans are pretty much the same, or you know, you can understand a lot about human nature that way. And I really enjoyed, you know, finding out that despite the 600-700 or more years between now and then, some things were still very relatable.
I think so, because I only read a bit of Chaucer when I was doing my A-level in English literature.
Yeah.
Which for international viewers is the exams that you do between 16 and 18 at high school. And I remember being very captivated as well, despite the fact that the words looked so strange on the page and they sounded a bit odd when you read them out loud as well. But actually it was this sort of lively, bustling world, and like quite hilarious as well, that, you know, you sort of see the kind of the personalities and the situations that happen in the stories.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there's a lot of it there. I mean, I think the nice thing about Chaucer as well is that he was, you know, I don't know if they called it poet laureate back then, but that's definitely what he was. And he had such versatility. He could be like really high-minded and do courtly poetry, but he could also do fabliaux and really crude, bawdy humour that carried on forward into Shakespeare.
Yeah,
as well.
Which never dates, right? Dirty
exactly.
jokes.
Exactly.
Is there anything from that area of your life or that period of time that you feel has actually carried through in terms of what you do now in design?
Yes, I think so. I mean, I think the thing that I probably would have gone on with was maybe art history. I think because while studying that, I got really interested in gargoyles and artisans, and, you know, the marginal illustrations or illuminations, you know, the people who were, you know, creating the art. Well, I think even now, you know, people tend to conceive of design as, you know, the designer or the name or the face. There's very little consideration for the people who are working with them. And so talk about Michelangelo in the Sistine Chapel. Well, he didn't do it all by himself.
Definitely not.
There's he had loads of people helping him. And it's the same with architecture. You've got someone's creative vision and the whole team of people to realise it. And the thing that struck me with medieval stuff is that a lot of these people would have been illiterate. They know their stuff really well. They can communicate, obviously, and say, you know, if the, you know, designer has their vision, okay, well, I want it like this, can you build it like that? And they could just go ahead and do it. And that kind of stuff was not really recognised. And on one hand, I wasn't surprised, but it did mean that I was very fascinated with the people who made, because knitting is a really old prehistoric craft as well, like stonemasonry and, you know, smithing, that kind of thing. And these are skills that have been passed down for, you know, hundreds and hundreds, you know, maybe even thousands of years, maybe, depending on what it is. And it's amazing that they have, you know, survived for so long. And that, I already respected sewing and knitting in that respect, but then to just see that that way of thinking, that survival, extend to other arts and crafts as well, ones that people don't necessarily get a chance to try nowadays. I thought this is really special, and I wanted to, you know, learn more about that, because really when people's work, it tells a narrative. It's a narrative, isn't it? It's an account of themselves. You know, when you look at your knitting, you might, you might get caught by the cat or something. You might put it down mid-row and then there's a little kink in it where the needle's stretched a little, and you might be able to press or block it out. But it's an account, it's an artefact or something, it's a relic of what you were doing. And equally, when you look at the way that various art and crafts techniques have developed through the centuries, you can see, oh, okay, they were doing it like this, or these were the kind of pigments they were using for painting. And I really, really became fascinated with how knowledge got passed on and what we can learn just by studying the pieces of people's creative work and enterprise that were left behind.
Yeah.
So, yeah, that's where I would have taken it if I'd stayed on with it. But I just figured, well, you know, I felt that I would get more out of it and I could contribute more by actually being it and living it and making sure it continues.
Yeah, definitely. So as well as designing, you also do teach.
Yeah.
Was that a natural progression for you to move into teaching?
Yeah, I think so. It took me a while to figure out what I enjoyed doing. I think the only thing that I think has actually panned out into adult life from childhood is writing. I always liked writing and writing stories and things like that. And but I didn't realise how much I enjoyed teaching, really, until a lot later, really. I just thought, this is quite nice. And it just felt like a natural thing to do because people often just, you know, would just ask me things, you know, oh, how do I do that? Or how did you do that? And I think that's something that I get from my dad. My dad is really good at explaining things generally. And he has a really good way with people. And I think that's something that I think crossed over naturally in a way. So I first started teaching knitting on a really casual basis. I think by then I had left the academic side of things and I was working for Rowan Yarns, and they had their hour teachings which were free at John Lewis and stuff at the time. And I think the first or second week I was there, they said, okay, you're going to do it this week. You watched us last week. You know how it goes. Off you go. And it was just like push into the deep end. And obviously my heart was absolutely pounding, but I really enjoyed it. And I just thought, my goodness, it seems to be working. They're doing what I've instructed them to do, I suppose I would say now. But yeah, I just thought, just pretend it's people you know and that, you know, it's all fine, it's all relaxed. And yeah, it just got to the point where I was just doing it all the time, every week. And then I think I went on to do workshops, like day-long workshops for them. And then that led to teaching at Sew Over It and a shop in Muswell Hill called Fringe, which I think is now called Slip Stitch. And it just grew from there, really. From there, I went into further education and higher education. And now it's mostly Vogue with lockdown and stuff. But yeah, I think it was sort of a bit of a surprise, really, with teaching. I didn't realise that I would love it that much. And I think if I was going to go back to study anything, it would probably be to get a full master's in education. So I have have a third of it with the accreditation. But I think there's loads that I'd like to explore. I mean, I just love learning from other people and not just them teaching me, because, you know, when you teach people, it's always a dialogue. They learn from you, as I suppose in that designated role, but you learn from them. But also just having people teach you about themselves as well, how they process information, how they interpret your instructions. You know, so much of it is, you know, dialogue. You know, when you have photographer and subject, that kind of thing. It's very much two-way street and people's skills. And I think that, you know, the best teachers or photographers or composers, artists understand a lot about people. They have that empathy. And it shows through in their work. The storytelling is always there, I think. And yeah, I think that I don't think I'd ever stop teaching, to be honest. I think that was probably why I was so emphatic when I met you. It's like, this is what I do and I love it.
It was really striking that you know, you really are passionate about it. So do you find that through the kind of handcraft and the hand making, is that a natural way to kind of make connections with people and their backgrounds and stories?
Yeah, easily, because I think the thing with knitting is that when you teach something like knitting or crochet, you know, it's not noisy and you don't need a lot of equipment with it. It's very portable and it piques a lot of curiosity as well. I mean, you know, I'm far from the only one here who's knitted on public transport or crochet, for example. I mean, there's somehow the conversation just floats into your ear. Oh, my grandma used to knit. It's like, well, I wonder why you're talking about that. You weren't before, and all of a sudden you just feel the eyes on you, that kind of thing. And it's nice. It piques people's interest. And when you're teaching as well, or you have knitting groups and stuff, I think the meditative nature of it just makes people open up. You feel like, you know, you're part teacher, part counsellor, part barmaid or something like that. And, you know, sometimes, you know, and, you know, it's about the environment you create sometimes. And I think that that's where the people skills come into it. You get the most out of it, out of these things, these handcrafts, you know, teaching, photography, and when you can connect with people. And once people start to feel really relaxed and comfortable in your presence and, you know, obviously the skills are going in and the muscle memory is being programmed. And, you know, you have those positive associations building up as well. It can be really good for, you know, people connecting with each other, but also people connecting with themselves. Because a lot of the people that I used to teach, it was evening classes mostly, or weekends, and it was them snatching little bits of time for themselves. I mean, I had one crochet student who said, right, I haven't told anybody where I am. I've just come straight from work. Nobody. I just said I'm going to be home late, and that's it. And that's how it was while the class was on. It was just her time that she'd got, and she wasn't the doctor, she wasn't a mum, she wasn't a wife, she wasn't anything else. She was just her.
Her time that just belonged to her in that sort of space.
Yeah, and you know, sometimes it's nice to have an activity that connects with that, because she's got people who are not going to ask her anything, or you know, and you know, people nobody obviously minds the obligations you have and the relationships you have in your life, but sometimes it's just finding that relief, you know, just little spaces, I think. And, you know, by letting people connect to that with themselves, by taking a class that's just for themselves, you could do a lot of good for teaching, because, you know, if someone takes a class, it's not necessarily for anybody else's benefit, it's just because they like it. And I think a lot of people don't have that necessarily.
And also, it sounded like you've taught people from quite a wide variety of backgrounds and kind of skill levels as well.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's been you know, just anyone off the street who wants to come into the shop, or who can book some classes free, sometimes not. Undergraduate students, and then it's also been you know, I suppose what they call vulnerable groups. Some of the stuff that I've done has been funded by Lambeth Council, and that involves working with, you know, people who are not necessarily in a good place in their lives. Sometimes these people might be homeless, sometimes they might have escaped abusive relationships, that kind of thing. And so the sewing or knitting or whatever I might be teaching for them becomes very much an occupational therapy. And it's really poignant, because with those courses, they're a little bit longer as well, and you know, you help these people to build up a routine. And you said, okay, this is what we're going to be doing every Monday morning, for example. We're going to be doing this and this for 2 or 3 hours, and you know, and so obviously the people skills and connecting with them really is important for stuff like that. And it's really a privilege to just see people develop. You know, they might not have any confidence at all, but you know, once you get them in front of the sewing machines, I think I did mostly sewing for people like that. It just got completely immersed in the task, and I think, you know, the thing with sewing is that, you know, you have a noisy machine, you're very interested and focused on your own work. And in some ways, I suppose, if you compare it to a knitting group, it's a little bit more antisocial. But actually that focus was better for people like that, because, you know, if you don't want to talk to anybody, you've got an excuse. If you just want to get on with it. Otherwise, if you feel like sitting up and looking around, it's a question of making eye contact and say, well, who else wants a break from their machine? Yeah. And, you know, equally as well as the vulnerable adults, it was mothers of young children as well, who can often get forgotten about, especially if they have lower incomes. And, you know, those classes ran during the school hours. So they would have the creche open if their children weren't actually of school age. And they'd just have that open for the duration of the class. They'd come in with me, and we would just do projects. And the same projects I used to give them, I really made sure to embed a lot of skills in them. So it'd be things like a tote bag, but I'd make sure I put a zip in there, because they're always really keen to develop their skills, thinking about making stuff for their children. And of course, that really got me in the fields, because that was my mum and grandma years ago. And I think that I think they were probably one of the favourite groups that I had to teach, because, you know, they'd go home, they'd tell me about, you know, their children watching them, or what did you make today, Mummy? And I just thought, oh my gosh, this is just me several times over.
And it's a really interesting kind of circular route between your connection with your, you know, female ancestry, who actually were professionals and who were highly skilled, and then sort of your, you know, moving those skills through to other people to kind of start up that cycle maybe again with other families.
I hope so. I mean, because you know, just seeing sometimes, you know, after class they'd have their children in, or some of their older ones would come in, and you know, they'd ask you questions. You know, oh, what are you doing? And then of course you've got this sweet little child with a curious little face looking at what's happening, and you know, of course I'm going to share them. And you know, it's they're really fascinated with it. They don't necessarily have the patience as I didn't when I was small, but it's something that they see their mum doing, and I think that formative influence is really important for children, and it really made me think about just how much that's impacted me, and I never would have really thought about that at the time. It's only as I've got older that I've just realised that a lot of the things that mean a lot to me now, professionally and personally, were all set during childhood, really.
I mean, it really sounds like the act of making and just a kind of creativity as a normal part of your lifestyle and your household. It really sounds like that has sort of surrounded you throughout your whole life.
Yeah, it has, and I think, but I never really thought of it like that.
Because it was normal.
Yeah, this was normal, and it was only really going out and meeting other people and talking to other people that I just thought, well, actually, this doesn't happen to a lot of other people.
Yeah, and then you kind of realise quite how lucky actually you were, because I've noticed that as well with my family. You know, everyone was always making stuff. There were professional tailors in my family as well, and everyone made their own clothes, and it was just what people did. And then suddenly you realise that actually not everybody has had that privilege and that sort of skill as well, actually being passed through the family. Although, you know, in my family there's a lot of amateurs as well, but that sort of like the curiosity and the tinkering and the kind of playfulness, as you said. Do you have any advice for people who aren't from those kind of backgrounds, but then maybe want to invite more making into their daily life?
Just go for it, honestly, because you know, I think if you don't have an example like that from a young age, it can all look really daunting. And I think one of the things that I have learned from teaching is just how much people are not necessarily afraid of, but are very reticent about learning because they feel like it's not for them. And it's very rare that they can actually explain why they feel like they couldn't do it. But there's something in them that sort of blocks them from thinking it's, you know, I don't know whether it's accessibility, because, you know, some practical subjects are not really taught in schools anymore. Or it's just thinking that it's a, you know, a high-low elitist kind of thing. I don't know, or they've never really, or maybe they just are not confident, but you have to try. I think that is one of the mainstays of creativity, really. You have to be willing to try things, and, you know, when things don't work, and honestly, let me tell you, you know as well, because, you know, a lot of stuff flops. I mean, you get one, you can have a number of good, successful designs, but the route to get there is strewn with, you know, trial and error, stuff that didn't work.
And a lot of failure.
Exactly. I mean, and I think the thing that I think frightens a lot of people from trying it, and also undergraduate students as well, is understanding that failure is part of the creative process. And when you create something, you also destroy something. And you know, it's true. I mean, you're just destroying, you know, whether past iterations of an idea or ideas you had about yourself in that process of creation. It can be quite painful and frightening if you're not used to it. And a lot of people take it personally if something they try doesn't work, and it's not a reflection on them. This is just what it is. I think once you realise that that's normal, or you allow it to become normalised as part of, you know, just the course of making, then, you know, it's a lot easier on you, I think.
Yeah, I think so. And I think, again, it's part of that sort of not realising what you know when you've grown up around that, and you, again, sort of taking things for granted, that actually, you know, you have to be very resilient as a maker, and very determined, and just have like the ultimate core belief in yourself, because if what you've made goes wrong or is ugly or falls apart, you know, that doesn't mean that you're bad at X, Y, or Z. It just means that you need to improve your skills in some certain manner, and sort of having the ability to identify that and
exactly, and
forward.
also, just evaluate, reflect. It's like, why didn't it work? It didn't not work because you're rubbish. It didn't work because of something else. And it's kind of like, you know, experiences like that, you know, they're a bit like post-dated checks, aren't they, really? You don't necessarily get the benefit of them until, you know, a certain time in the future, and you don't really reap the benefit of it until, you know, until after a certain period of commitment. I mean, there are things that, you know, that I think that I have done. It's like, well, you know, I wouldn't have known that if this hadn't flopped, or if, you know, I know not to use that fabric because that's going to do this, and how do I know that? And I tell that to my students all the time. You know, anytime I tell you something, ask me how I know. And it's absolutely true. And The one thing that I really like actually, and this is a bit perverse, is when I do sewing demonstrations and they go wrong. Honestly, the feeling around you when people are watching, and it's like she's the teacher and something went wrong for her, and it automatically makes people feel a lot better. And, you know, and it's not necessarily a schadenfreude kind of thing. It's just seeing that, you know, you are not above mistakes. And I think the worst thing is when, you know, creativity is presented as something that just flows naturally or comes naturally to people. And in some ways it does, but the journey is often pretty bumpy. You know, there's unpickers for a reason. And, you know, there's tinking or frogging for a reason. There's a lot of pulling out and starting again. And, I think when I have demonstrations that fail or I need to restart and say, OK, I need a minute, come back, I'll talk amongst yourselves kind of thing, it makes them feel so much better about stuff going wrong with their own work because, you know, they're using me as an example. And it's a big responsibility, I think, when you have a lot of knowledge, you know, in families like ours, when you've grown up around it. It's not just the passing on of the skills, but also helping people to cope with the load that comes with it. You know, you mentioned resilience, but there's actually a lot of strength and objectivity in being able to cope with the process of it, because that, I think, is the challenge for a lot of people, the process of creating things. It's not just making, it's a process that can be completely different.
So you mean not just the technical actions of the hands?
Yeah, it's the emotional baggage as well,
Oh,
because, you know, you have this emotional investment in something. You know, it's the same when you cook for people or, you know, buy them something nice. You're just doing it with an intent to make something or someone feel happy or produce something beautiful. And there's a load of emotional investment in it. And I think that that side of things is another thing that people find challenging. And so when you see that, you know, someone else has messed things up or they're upset with how something turned out or they wish they'd done something better, I think that humanises a process or a skill of creating and making that can look magical from far off when you're not in it all the time, I think.
That's true. And it still is magical.
Yeah, it still is. Just because you know how to cast the spell
yeah,
doesn't mean it's any less magical.
And it is casting on as well.
Yeah, exactly.
So these days, now that you're not working your little samples on your pink plastic flatbed, what's your favourite thing to knit now?
It's actually still jumpers and cardigans, really. I mean, I have a soft spot for shawls. I just love the feeling of being wrapped up. But it's still jumpers and cardigans. I mean, I just love that because you get that nice fusion of fashion and textiles because you're still creating the fabric with pattern and stuff, as we were talking about earlier. But when you have sweaters and cardigans, you've got silhouette in there as well, which is a bit more, I suppose, traditionally fashion, how they would approach design. And so you can experiment with shape, you know, sleeve shapes, necklines, all that kind of thing. You can get two in one. And the way that you create the fabric when swatching, you're then thinking about engineering on not just a small scale with the fabric, but also, you know, how it's going to be worn, how it's going to be fit, the body that's going to wear it, that kind of thing. And also, you know, how it fits into people's lifestyles as well, because, you know, there's always that gap or not necessarily tension, but there's how you intend your design to be and how other people make it for themselves. When you make clothes, it's really important to engineer or create them, or at least say something in the pattern about, you know, what people can do to do things differently. One lady who recently knitted my Bonnie sweater, I mean, I put something in the pattern notes about the different yarns you can use for it, and basically you can use any yarn, but it depends on what you want to get out of it. And she chose a cotton and linen blend, I think, and it looked really beautiful. It had this lovely sort of it wasn't iridescent, but it had a really beautiful sheen on the yarn, and the definition and the softness of it I really, really liked. And that was, you know, completely different to the solid, crunchy, crisp cotton that I had used. It just had that character to it. And she made it with it was a black skirt that had a silver kind of print to match the silver yarn that she'd used. And I love that. One of the nicest things for me is when people take my designs and interpret them in their own way. Because that tells me that, you know, they've made a connection with it and I've made a connection with them. They saw something in it that they could make their own. I think, you know, and obviously it's not a problem if they decide to make it exactly as I've made it in the same colour. But I just love it when people do things to suit themselves, because that's as it should be.
It is, yeah, definitely. And I think just continuing to empower people to feel like they've got that autonomy as well.
Exactly.
Through because it's their project. You know?
And they're the ones wearing it, really. I mean, it's not that I don't care, but it's much more important that they're happy with it. And, you know, when I used to work in Liberties and John Lewis, there were people who'd come in sheepishly and say, "Oh, can I change the colours?" It's like, yes, of course you can change the colours. This is one of the most fun bits of my job. Which colours would you like? Let me start pulling all the balls of yarn off the shelf and we can have fun with it. And, you know, when people have got time, they really get into it, because they think about, you know, I say, well, what colours do you have in your wardrobe? It becomes more of a styling thing and an interactive process. And that's how it should be. I would never want to design something or put out a pattern that people couldn't get stuck into if they didn't want to. That's really what I want. It's just a starting point.
Yeah, so somewhere between storytelling and play.
Yeah, exactly. All the good things that apparently adults can't do anymore. That's what I really want. And I'll always make time for it. And I would hope that, you know, people can feel some of that when they knit my patterns as well. That's really what I want to get across. It's something that's to be enjoyed. I never put anything out that's not nice to knit. That's just, it doesn't matter how nice it is. If it's not a pleasure to knit, then it's in the sin bin, basically. It's just no.
So on that note, where can people find you online? Where's the best place to see where you're up to?
Well, favourite social media platform is Instagram. I usually post on there about 4 times a week.
Okay.
And then otherwise it's my website, natalieinstitches.com. And I write blog posts there every fortnight. You can also sign up to my newsletter, which is every fortnight. So blog posts and newsletter, it's either one or the other. And then I also have a pattern shop there, which is very tiny at the moment, but it's growing. And yeah, I think those are the main places: Instagram, website, newsletter.
Great. So check Natalie out online to keep finding out about what's going on in that beautiful mind and see what's on her needles. Thank you so much, Natalie.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for inviting me on. It's been a pleasure.
Yes, it has.
Bye.